Hello and welcome to yet another Tattered Cover virtual event. My name is Adam. I am the director of events with Tattered Cover. And for those who don't know, Tattered Cover is the largest independent bookstore in Denver and in Colorado here in the United States. And we are so grateful to readers like you who join us virtually throughout this very long pandemic so we can keep authors safe. And we've been around for 50 years. And it's because of readers like you, seriously. So thank you so much. Keep supporting independent bookstores. Keep buying books from independent bookstores. It really does mean the world to us when we see people in the chat congratulating Michelle already. And it's so amazing. If you're interested in more virtual events, we have tattercover.com/event with all of our virtual events. We have coming up quite a few. I'll highlight one. Jennifer J. Chow and Kate Lansing are doing a talk about their mystery books next Tuesday, the 26th. So check that out, tattercover.com/events. Before I go any further, I do want to say if you need or want closed captioning, there is a bar at the bottom of your YouTube screen. If you click CC, that'll be your closed captioning. Tonight, I am so excited to welcome the author of The Wake Up, Closing the Gap Between Good Intentions and Real Change, Michelle Mijung Kim. She is a queer immigrant, Korean-American woman, writer, speaker, and social entrepreneur, challenging the status quo in tech and beyond. She is the CEO and co-founder of Awaken, a leading provider of interactive equity and inclusion education programs facilitated by major BIPOC educators, where she has consulted hundreds of organizations and top executives from Fortune 500, tech giants, nonprofits, and government agencies to spark meaningful change. Michelle has been a lifelong social justice advocate and has served on a variety of organizations such as the San Francisco LGBTQ Speakers Bureau, San Francisco Human Rights Commission, Advisory Committee, Lyric Nonprofits Board of Director, Build Tech We Trust Coalition, and many, many more. She currently serves on the Asian Americans for Civil Rights and Equality. Her work has appeared in platforms like the Harvard Business Review, Forbes, the New York Times, NPR, and she has been named Medium's top writer in diversity 3 years in a row. She has written the book, The Wake Up. She will be in conversation with her editor, Renee Sedliar from Hachette Go. And this is going to be an amazing conversation. Michelle and Renee, please come back on and take it away because they're here for you, not me.
Thank you so much, Adam.
Thank you. Enjoy. Have a great conversation. Everyone in the audience, I'm looking over here because that's where the screen is, but everyone in the audience, put your chat in, or questions in the chat, and I'll get them to Michelle and Renee, but it's you ladies. Have a good one.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Adam. And I also just want to say thank you to Tattered Cover for hosting this event. I'm so excited to be talking with you, Michelle. Thank you for wanting to chat with me in this forum. Obviously, we've talked a lot about the book in very close proximity. I'm just really excited to have this chance to share with a larger group about the process and ask you some questions about how the process was for you.
Absolutely. Thank you for agreeing to do this, Renee. For everyone watching, this is our first official conversation together publicly about the process that we went through. And I'm just really excited to be in conversation with you, given your depth of knowledge and understanding of the book and what we went through together. So I'm really looking forward to it. Hi, everyone. It's nice to see y'all. I'm going to be checking the chat. And so please feel free to ask questions. We really want to make this as useful and intimate as possible. So thanks for having me.
Yes, and thank you to everyone for joining. I hope you enjoy the conversation. So Michelle, gosh, so many questions, so many things to talk about. But I think one of the things that we come back to time and time again, obviously we're on a really compressed schedule for this book. We wrote it quickly because we wanted to get it out in time. And I think one of the things that was interesting to me about the process, and I think was very interesting for you, was the evolution of the book. You put together this terrific proposal, and we had our first great conversation about it. But the book became, during the writing, it obviously became something, I think, bigger than we had both intended in a really lovely and wonderful way. And I would love to hear you kind of talk about, you talk about the process of writing the book and that evolution and what that was like, because obviously at the beginning, we always knew that the book was, as the subtitle says, closing the gap between good intentions and real change. And we knew what we wanted the book to accomplish in terms of giving people a toolkit for making change and creating change. But I would love to hear you talk about that evolution and how the book did become something, I think, beyond what we both imagined in a really beautiful and wonderful way.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for allowing for that evolution to happen. Also, I think that's something that I really appreciated throughout our working together, was the flexibility and the understanding around what I wanted this to become, with everything that was being experienced by the world and by me. So I feel like my original intention for the book, that I don't want to say it changed completely, because I think that was still the foundation of why I wrote the book, and my desire for me to create something that was useful for people who are genuinely wanting to do work to advance equity and justice in the world. And instead of putting together sort of a manual on how to, based on a list of, to-dos or checklists, which is what so often people crave when it comes to equity and inclusion work, I wanted to give people a set of principles that they can really anchor themselves in. And with that, I started writing the book, but what I didn't anticipate was how truly personal this book was going to be, in terms of my retelling of my experiences and my stories. And I knew some of that was going to happen throughout my writing process, but I didn't realize how deep I was going to go and how vulnerable I was going to decide to be throughout the writing process. And I think part of that was so much of what we were experiencing couldn't be compartmentalized in such a way that so often people over intellectualize this work of doing, diversity, equity, and inclusion, whether in the corporate space or whatever workplace that people are talking about this in, or even at society at large. That I think the evolution needed to happen in order for me to humanize the work. So I think that was one very core part of the evolution of the book, is that it became something that was a lot more personal, a lot more vulnerable and raw in terms of my storytelling, beyond just these are the things that you need to learn in order for you to do this work, right? Because I think the central sort of theme and through line in this book is that this work is deeply personal, that this book cannot be hyper intellectualized and lived in the headspace, that it has to be brought down to the heart space, to understanding and humanizing this work, because it's impacting real people, and that people are frankly dying. And that's part of my big why and why I do this. And I wanted people, as they're learning about the principles, as they're gaining the lessons, to never, ever forget that there are human lives that's at stake with this work. And also, I think such an important part of my work is also understanding that this work is never over for anyone. And for me to be able to model that with my own storytelling of the times that I didn't meet my own expectations, or when I, have felt ashamed for a variety of reasons, I wanted those stories to also be told. And then I think we've talked about this before, where in March, the Atlanta shooting was really such an event that we weren't anticipating, obviously. And when it happened, it really threw me off for weeks. And we have a whole chapter dedicated to that really awful event. And that wasn't planned. So that was also a huge part of the evolution of the book, is deciding to sort of make room for the stories that I felt were so important for us to share. And me going on that journey of excavating my own lived experiences as a queer woman, as a Korean American woman living in this country, and making room for that.
Yeah. And that's, thank you for that, because I remember so clearly when we were working chapter 13, creating our own liberatory tools, and how that chapter was such, every chapter was really such an important moment in the crafting of the book, and thinking about what we wanted to give people for their toolkit. But that chapter in particular was so profound, because it really, for me, was one of those, it really, it encapsulated the book in a very specific way in terms of all of the things that we were talking about really came out in that chapter. And, a couple of things that you just said in terms of making sure your personal experience was in there. I think the narrative part of it is such a huge, compelling part of the book, because when we're talking about doing the work, and the whole point of the book being you can't just, there aren't 10 steps. You can't just best practice your way out of this, which is one of the lines that you'd said, I think, from the beginning, that it is this organic, living, breathing thing. And I think those of us who love books feel that way about any book, but this in particular, no matter where you are on your own path or your own journey, you can always go back. And there's something you can always find, whether it's anchoring the reader, anchoring themselves in your narrative and finding something new in that, or finding a new way to look at one of the tools that you give. And I think that one of the there were so many beautiful moments in the evolution, but that one, it sticks out for me as well, the crafting of that chapter, because it really, everything came to, and I remember saying to you at several points, like, this chapter really is, it's almost, it's a standalone piece, which is not to say that it isn't integrated, it's not a part of the book, but it is just a full, it's this full moment, because it was so rooted in something that had just happened and your visceral response to it, and then crafting that on the page and bringing it into the book. And we had discussions about where would this chapter fit.
Yeah.
And where so many discussions about that, and thinking about the reader, and thinking about how we wanted readers to respond to it, and what we wanted and hoped the reader would take away. And with this very raw emotion, putting that on the page, and then knowing that how some readers would respond to it, either, again, emotionally, viscerally, or having a new perspective, or opening their eyes to something in a way they hadn't thought about before, and then applying the rest of the tools. And that was definitely, it was such a profound moment in the writing of the book. And that was, I mean, it was, like you said, it was unexpected, of course, and how it found its way into the book was so critical and so important. And thank you for putting that in there, because you could have just said, no, this is too much, and not for this book, for something else.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I almost did not include it. And I remember we were having that conversation around, where does this story belong? And we almost put that chapter as an epilogue, or at some point I was also convincing myself, like, you know what, this is just like a standalone piece. Maybe I'll just host it on my blog instead of having it in the book. But, what I realized, even when I started writing the book, there were so many things that we were grappling with as a society at large, and particularly around anti-Asian violence. And I couldn't not talk about that. And I couldn't not let that also be a major part of my narrative, because it is in my life. And having that be missing from the book felt dishonest in terms of my own storytelling, and sort of the impact of what it means for us to be doing social justice work at a very personal level. And I think that's part of the, major themes that come up throughout the book, is that all of these things are connected in terms of the systemic oppression that we're talking about, how that's experienced at a personal level, how that is reinforced at organizational level. And I really, it was not an easy chapter to write. I remember I spent just weeks on that one chapter, and it wasn't actually planned to be in the book. And I'm just grateful that I was able to weave it in, and it still remains one of my favorite chapters that I wrote in the book.
Yeah, it's one of mine too. And it's hard to say, because I feel like every chapter brought something new. And it was so interesting when we acquired, I think this story, when we acquired the book and we were discussing it in-house, everyone from the proposal, everyone of my colleagues had something that they focused on in the proposal. And that to me spoke volumes in terms of how my hopes for the book out in the world, in terms of meeting anyone wherever they are, in, whether you're just starting along your journey and you're learning about white supremacy and the deep roots, or if you feel like, okay, I know, I have that information, I know a little bit about that, I can take this on. Or when you talk about harm and trauma. Every chapter, there's such richness there in terms of there's something I feel like for everybody to focus in on, and even if it's just one point of departure, taking that and moving outward, and like you said, finding it in every aspect of your life. How can I do the work, and how can I embrace it fully using the foundation that I have? And I think that is one of the things that resonates, especially in chapter 13, but in every chapter. And of course, the example that I like to talk about is Second Courageous, which I think is such one of the many tools in the toolkit that you offer. Because again, I think that the things that you offer here, it's not the 10 steps, but it very much is these practices and principles that live on, and you can apply them wherever you are. So again, Second Courageous. I don't know if you want to talk about Second Courageous, but I know we talked about Second Courageous a lot, but just in terms of balancing out giving people the information and the why and the underpinnings and the foundations, and then saying, here's something that you can do. Here's a strategy, and here's something you can take with you on your own journey.
Yeah.
Which I just think is a terrific part of the book as well, in terms of the practical aspects.
Yeah. And I think, the instinct that people have who are waking up to different realities that they haven't lived, and they are wanting to rush out and do something right now. And we see that time after time when there's a crisis, right? Whether that is Black Lives Matter or anti-Asian hate, people, once they realize there's this particular type of systemic oppression that persists, want to be a part of the movement. And usually the number one question I get is, tell me what to do. All right. And sometimes that question also evolves into, tell me what to say, what not to say, in a very sort of practical level. And that's how people register what is practical, is being given a list of checklists to check off so that they can, feel like they're doing stuff. And I think that is completely understandable and very limiting and reductive in the way that we approach this work, because as soon as the context shifts, then people don't know how to adapt the way that they are creating change in their spheres of influence. So really, to your point, what I wanted to achieve with this book is not necessarily the 10 steps for you to become an ally, but rather what are the core principles and values that we have to be aligned on, so that no matter what the context is, we know how to think about the problem, and we know how to approach, and we know how to craft our own checklists of things that we can do in whatever changing moments, so people can feel grounded and empowered in their own knowledge and the practice of it, rather than being given, a listicle, right? Top 10 things that you could do right now, which I've written plenty, but it's what I realized is I can't keep creating these lists for people to hold on to. I actually need to help people write their own lists. And I think concepts like, Second Courageous, and for those of you who haven't gotten to that chapter yet, it's this notion that we can't, no movement is born with single heroes, right? There is no movement that started with one person and that was the end of it, right? We see movements happen because there's the first courageous person who takes a stand, and then a bunch of us join the movement to say, whether it's Me Too, whether it's joining a walkout or strike or whatever that's happening in the world today, requires that second person, and not the singularity of that one person, but the volume of people who are coming out, inspired by the first person who took that courageous stance and standing in solidarity with them. And I talk about very, common scenarios that happen that I've lived through when I was in corporate America, when I was in tech companies, or even when I was a facilitator in these rooms having conversations with folks. It's actually really easy for us to role play, somebody saying something insensitive and then interrupting that. That's usually how the scenario practice goes, is, okay, so somebody says something that's insensitive. What are you going to do to interrupt? And usually the scene kind of ends there, when in reality, when I've experienced microaggressions or harm in the workplace, and somebody like me say, hey, actually, that wasn't right. Usually the scene doesn't just end there. It usually goes on into a really awkward space of people feeling defensive or people wanting that moment to just quickly pass, and the person who just got called out getting defensive and pushing back, right? Like, oh, it was just a joke, chill out. And then the scene kind of awkwardly ends there.
Mhm.
And for me, in those moments, I needed another person to back me up, right? And I needed more people to create the culture of accountability rather than one of permissiveness. So that's just one, very practical concept that people can hold on to. So when they're not the one who is interrupting harm in the moment, that they could at least be the second person to have the back of the person who just took a really courageous step to call in harm or to raise questions about harmful practices.
Yeah, and I think that's such a great example for a lot of what the book does. There's a lot of nuance and there's a lot of subtlety. And again, everything that you're pointing out in terms of, this isn't, it's simple in one way, and that we've identified a particular problem and we want to do something about it. But with that, there's so much to state the obvious. And so what I think you did so beautifully in the book is that there was a marriage of that, the nuance, and talking about the whys and the deep tentacles of how we got where we are. And then, for anyone who might be like, oh, this is there's just a lot of information here. What do I do with this? And then you do offer these things that you can carry forward again in any situation. And I think for me, one of the things about reading this is I've taken in a lot of this so that it helps you reframe, so that when you are in a situation, and again, that second courageous is such a great example, because I think we've all been in situations where either we've been the victim or we've been sitting there and going, oh my gosh, what do I do? And then the moment passes and someone says, oh, it's a joke. And then it moves on. And then you think later on, oh gosh, why didn't I do something? Why didn't I say something? Or why didn't anyone come and help me out? And one of the things that you do so beautifully in the book is it's this instruction. People can take it in and it will become the response. It's showing people how to have the response to step up and be there and do the things that we all want to do. And maybe sometimes we're frozen. And I think that's the interesting point of when people say, what do I do? Just give me the list, tell me what to do. That's where this comes in, because it's all in there, and it's a great offering.
I think one of the things that I think often about is when it comes to doing change work and facilitating these conversations and educating folks and just moving this conversation forward isn't necessarily about telling people what to do, more so than holding up the mirror and letting people choose for themselves to be the people that they say they want to be. And I think that's such a powerful way for us to rethink about creating change, because so often people think that creating change is about changing people's minds, changing people's behaviors. But what I found really powerful is just listening to what people are saying in terms of who they want to be, right? So many people these days say that they want to be anti-racist, they want to be anti-oppressive, they want to be feminist, and all of these things. And we have so much to work with just from that declaration. And my job is then to hold up the mirror and help people choose their own paths and be in integrity with what they say their values are, who they say they want to be, rather than trying to convince them to care about something that they may, either not care, because I don't want to waste my time trying to convince people who don't care. Because there's so many of us already who care, who want to do the right thing, who are needing guidance and wanting to be in complexity and nuance and integrity. So this book for me is not just about trying to wake people up to the external forces of oppression, right? I think that's a core part of it for sure, in helping people understand the ways that oppression manifests in so many different ways in our society. But really, the harder part of the wake up is, how do we wake ourselves up to our own capacity to transform ourselves along the way that we are trying to transform the world, and how that needs to be in alignment with the work that we're trying to do in society at large, not just from a place of wanting to help other people or wanting to save other people, but wanting to understand more deeply about our own humanity and how we are impacted by systems of oppression, and how we have the capacity to be the people that we say we want to be.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Yes. That's so wonderful. And I thank you for that. And also you walk the talk. I mean, you do this on every page of the book. You hold the mirror up to yourself as well. And I think that's another thing that was so wonderful in the process. And as we were working with the chapters, you are probably too hard on yourself, but you hold yourself accountable. And I think that is one of the things too about the book, is that you challenge yourself as much as you challenge your readers. And what you bring forward is this, that, I'm still evolving. Clearly evolution is the word I love today, but you in the book saying, I'm still learning, I'm still evolving. And this stuff, we are in a dynamic time, and we are in a dynamic time because this cannot be solved, overnight, but that's why it's dynamic, because it's still there every day, the shift. And the fact that you are very clear about, here's the work that I'm doing, here's the work I've been doing, but also this is, sometimes I do things, I don't do the right thing either. And that's where we all are. And what do you do with that? So I think that was also just another wonderfully resonant and powerful part of the book. And I think for anyone who reads it, there's so much there in terms of what you bring to the page. And when I read the final manuscript, it was very much like I was sitting next to you. We were talking about things. I think it's the hallmark of a very successful and wonderful book. So
thank you so much. I mean, when you talk about how I'm sometimes overly critical of myself, I think you saw that front seat, front row seat, into how I also have ingrained in myself the voice of perfectionism and the teachings of white supremacy, and how I think part of what we as a culture need to learn and evolve and learn how to do is how we stay in the complexity and the nuance and the contradictions, and allowing room for us to not be perfect. But that was a terrifying thought for me, because being able to think some certain things and learning as we go is one thing, but putting my thoughts on paper for thousands of people to consume, and something that feels immutable, it felt terrifying. And there are so many times I wanted to call you and say, I don't know what you saw in me and the proposal, but I am not cut out for this. I cannot do this. And also, I think the insecurities around, who am I to write this book? Who am I to take up this space? And if I am this imperfect, if I am this, complex in terms of the contradictions that I embody and I live in, then who am I to write this book about how to live in alignment with our values when I can't be perfect? And I think especially as a queer person, but also as a queer and Asian woman, the messages that I've received throughout my life is that you don't take up space, right? Like I don't get to do that. I think there was a lot of unlearning while I was writing this book around how I thought about my own stories and the validity of them and the worthiness of them to be known and written about. And so in so many ways, I think this process was also a process of me reclaiming my stories, but also healing some really deeply wounded parts of me and allowing myself to be imperfect. Because I think for so long, I thought the only way for me to exist without, disappointing people is for me to be perfect. So I wanted to be really honest about that in the book. And I think part of the reason why I decided to share so many of my stories of when I failed to uphold my own values and my own integrity, I felt was betrayed, was because I know that that is such a common experience for so many people who are trekking this journey. And I think in those moments, we also need to find our grounding, and it needs to also come from a place of self-compassion and redemption in order for us to actually keep doing the work that we want to be committed to, because it's so easy for us to pop out of that and decide to go the other way in terms of just living our own lives without thinking about any of these issues. But ultimately that ends up creating harm for not just other people, but us too.
Yeah, and I'm really glad that, I mean, I know how much you struggled with some of those, with all of that, and I'm so glad that you felt that you wanted to, that you put it in the book, and that you wanted to put it in the book, because I think for everything that you just said in terms of people recognizing themselves in the pages, and feeling that, okay, if I don't, I trust Michelle, she's doing the work. I might not get it right all the time, or even most of the time, but that's a part of the process. And that fighting with perfection. I know you talk about perfection and sort of the how white supremacy has infiltrated the basic tenets, and perfection is one of them. And I thought that was such great, that is really important information. But just seeing you work through that, a lot of that as well, I think is just so profound for readers too, because when you can recognize yourself in the page, or recognize a challenge that the author is going through, that creates a safe space for readers. And I think, again, that is another hallmark of a book that wants to give people the tools. That's it. If they can recognize themselves and identify with you and say, oh, I can take this forward because Michelle has created this safe space for the readers that you will never meet, myriad folks who are out there, but creating that safe space for the reader to really hunker down and do the work is amazing. Yeah. And sharing that vulnerability. Thank you for that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I thank so many people who gave me that grace and permission to exist imperfectly. And when I was a young teenage activist, I was determined to prove myself. And I write about this in the book, where I was not only a harsh critic for myself, but for others. And I think I felt like that was the only way for us to do this work. And I think there was also, a sense of entitlement and arrogance attached to the way that I navigated the work of social justice. And also being stuck in the binary of like, okay, well, if you're not aligned on all these issues with me, then you're just a shitty person. And I have no business engaging with you. Versus as I really immerse myself in this work, I realize, oh, I have a lot of contradictions, right? I have a lot that I don't know. And so many people who taught me and who embraced me to be a part of the community allowed for me to be messy.
Yeah.
And with taking accountability, of course, never sort of evading that, but the allowing of that growth to actually happen, I think was such a blessing for me personally, and being led by the mentors and the visionaries and organizers who were, far more, who were experiencing far more brutality in the society, but who had the warmth and the compassion for me as somebody who was learning. And I don't take that lightly. And I feel like it's also my duty to pass on their work as much as I can.
Yeah, that's thank you for that. And I think, we're all messy. And I think, being able to acknowledge that, and that it's, that's a part of it. And no one gets through this without being messy. Like you said, accountability and just doing the best that you can, and doing better,
Yeah.
So are we, it's time for, okay, I guess we have questions now. Michelle, let's see, question from Tanmeet. Michelle, have you thought of putting together a book club kit? Great question, for a group to go through the book together and workshop the different tools together.
Yes, I think Renee, would you like to take that question?
We've actually, Tony, you plucked this right from our conversation yesterday, was it, Michelle? Yeah, we recognize that the book is right for that, and we're putting something together now because it just there's a lot to digest. There's a lot of words. There's a lot of it is not a quick book to read. I think it's a quick book to read because it's so good. But yeah, we are working on that because I think it's imperative to to give some just points of departure for the book. So yes, that is definitely in process.
Yes. And I especially love the idea of people reading this book together, because so much of the work that I've done, that I've learned to do in the world of social justice or even diversity, equity, and inclusion, is this stuff is hard to do alone. And I think so much comes out when we are in conversation. And I know, Grace Lee Boggs was such a proponent of being in conversation, that talk is not just frivolous activity, but that's where ideas emerge. That's where we debate each other. That's where we have healthy tension to explore. And I think this book, there's a lot of things that I think we can unpack together. So I know several folks who are organizing book clubs, but also inside organizations reading this together. And I think that's a really useful exercise in order to really, go beyond the reading experience and the intellectual experience of reading a text to what does this mean for me? What does this mean for us? How do we practice then this principle and implement it into our day-to-day, our spheres of influence? And something that I worry about a lot is a book remaining as an intellectual exercise that people do and feel really good about having read it, and then afterwards nothing changing. So much so that I dedicated a whole chapter on pleading the case for action beyond just reading the book. That I think doing this as a group is not only good for accountability, but also creating that support system. So I highly, highly recommend people doing this in community with people, because I think this work ultimately is about deepening our connection with each other as well as we discover our own and other people's expansive humanity. So I love that idea. And I love the idea of having something tangible that folks can feel supported by, whether that's a discussion guide or whatever we think of. And I'm open to different ideas too for folks. And I just love that we are able to have this rich conversation in community with each other.
Yes, and yeah, it lends itself well.
Hi, I'm just hopping in. That was the only question so far, but I know people are chatting in the chat, so I'm going to ask my question because that's the privilege of my job. Michelle, what's next? What do you want to tackle? Like, you've done so much already. Like, is there something that's like a 1 year, 2 year, 3 year plan that you have?
My plan when I grow up. What should I become when I grow up? That's such a good question, because I think this is the first time in my life where I don't have a clear answer on what's next. And I was, over a delicious vegan pasta. Renee and I talked about this, and I told her that this book to me feels like an epilogue to the chapter that I've been living for the last few years. And I realized before writing this book and during writing this book that so much of my relationship to this work has been rooted in my own trauma and working from a place of deep pain. And I am starting to be more curious about what does it look like for me to do this work and approach this work from a place of joy, from a place of abundance, from a place of community and love. And that's what I'm searching for next. And with that, I want to also give myself permission to rest and be in the unknown, which I've never really explored in my life. I started working when I was 14 and a half. I grew up low income, and as an immigrant, as a, child of a once undocumented parent, it was important for me to work. And I've not ever not worked And this book was sort of my way of putting everything that I've learned in my life and through my work in DEI and social justice into a much more accessible and scaled format so that people don't necessarily always have to access me or the company that I founded, Awaken, in order to do the meaningful work. So that's my hope, that I'm able to gift this to the community wanting to do this work. And also I'm not, disappearing, I'm not going anywhere, but that I'm allowing myself some spaciousness to think about what's next.
Yeah, I think that's super important. I feel like I ask that question and people are always telling me their next project, but it's okay to just take some time. Like, we need it. We're not machines.
Yeah.
This is always interesting. We always either have a lot of questions or no questions. People are always shy on the internet still. So I'll ask one more question, and if no one else hops on, we'll wrap it up.
Great.
You talked about this because of your relationship as writer, editor, but I guess what is the best part of your relationship? Like, what makes a writer and editor's relationship so special? I'd love to hear from both of you.
Renee, will you go first?
I think just trust. Like, fundamentally, you have to trust each other. And one of the things I like to say whenever I'm talking to any author, and Michelle, you'll probably recall this from our first call, like, I'm an expert in my space and you're an expert in your space, and we work together, bringing the best of ourselves. Because at the end of the day, we want to create this book, whether it's, no matter what genre it is, whether it's fiction, which can, move people so much, whether it's something that is a toolkit, that is a personal story. At the end of the day, we want to give something to the world that people are going to read and value, and it will do something for them. They take that out, whatever they do with that. But I think trust is fundamental to that. Accountability. I mean, so much of what Michelle talks about, I had to just bring it back to the book, but there really is that relationship. And it becomes you become very close. And we wrote this during Michelle wrote this during the pandemic. I was on the sidelines, but that was an added layer too, because you have to consider everything else that's going on in the middle of it. And I think just the exciting moments of the evolution, and when those things happen, and when you suddenly detour, but it's so right, or figuring out where that chapter goes. The craft and the details of it are, I love that part of it. But at the end of the day, it really is this coming together to create this amazing thing that is going to, it's the pebble in the pond, and it's going to resonate, and that's one of the most awesome things about it.
I love that answer around trust. I think that was such a fundamental part of our relationship and what made this book what it is, because of the mutual trust that we had. And I think it's important for me to acknowledge just like how hard it is to build trust, especially in a setting where there is time pressure and there is the difference in our identities and lived experiences, right? As a queer person, as a woman of color, navigating this space, and especially the publishing industry that is so incredibly white, and on a subject matter that is incredibly personal and nuanced and complex, I really wanted to find the right editor who can create space for me to explore all of that honestly, without me feeling like I need to sanitize or create some type of a version that is not completely honest. And I think, Renee, just like, kudos to your own practice of accountability and living the values that you care about, in creating that freedom for me to do that, and also holding firm on, sort of the advocacy that I needed for you to embody and practice when I was working with other stakeholders. I think that was also really important for me to witness in order for me to really, do the best work that I can. So I think that trust is so fundamental to the relationship, and just acknowledging honestly the differences, right, in our lived experiences, and you always acknowledging you being a white woman, and that always being sort of not something that we throw under the rug, but something that we always actively talked about, and allowing for me to express my concerns or doubts or my pain, and you being able to hold that with so much compassion and understanding. That meant a lot. And the whole period that we were in while I was writing this book was just so intense. Not only the pandemic, but we had the Capitol uprising, the insurrection, and then and there was the anti-Asian hate, there was the Atlanta shooting, and my grandmother passed away, and there were just so many things that happened in that short amount of time that we were writing this, that I really needed somebody who could see not just the writer who's supposed to produce this manuscript, but a human being who was being impacted by all these different forces and making space for that. So that, I think, really played such a critical role. And the other thing is, Renee really believed in the book. And I think that was such a critical part of my ability to sort of always come back to and ground myself in the possibility of what this could be. And I never once felt like Renee doubted my work or the vision that I had for the book, which is also so important when navigating this. And I also have to give a special shout out to Kimberly Lim, who's my developmental editor, who's an incredible editor who I got the pleasure and honor to work with, who also helped shape this book, who, it's such an interesting thing when there's so many people who are involved in this book, and not everybody's going to get the recognition that they should get. And she's definitely one of the people that I want to make sure that gets the shout out.
Definitely. And we have 2 more questions. I think we have time for one, but if we go quick, we'll get both. Patrick asks, this book presents these concepts in such an inclusive way. Is there anything that didn't make the cut that we should also be thinking about?
I mean, there are always going to be so many things that I feel like could have been explored more in depth. So one of the things that was important for me to do in this book is, as much as I can, make the principles be applicable to all systems of oppression, right? So that this book is not just about dismantling racism or, sexism, but that these systems of oppression share very interesting and common patterns that we can disrupt in different ways. So I talk about all the isms and different communities, but that also is coming from a place of, incredibly limited lived experiences. So I think that it would be dishonest for me to say that this is like the most inclusive book, because it can't be, given the limited lived experiences that I have as somebody who don't hold all the marginalized identities. With that said, I think, what chapter 13 introduced that I wasn't fully committed to introducing in the beginning of the writing process was the stories around people fighting for abolition. And I think that is a thread that I'm continuing to pull on in terms of how do we incorporate that conversation that I think is such an urgent conversation for everyone to be having, in every context, even if it's around the workplace, and how the principles of abolition and policing and anti-Blackness, all of these things actually manifest in different spheres of our lives. So I would say that would be sort of the thing that ended up making into the book, that I'm really glad that made it into the book, because I actually think that it applies a lot more widely than people think about and give credit to. But there isn't like one topic that I had planned on putting it into the book that didn't make it, because I think, Renee, you and I were really intentional about creating space for everything that I wanted to put in there. So that's a good question, but I'll continue thinking about that.
Next book.
We'll wrap up with this question. Michelle, who or what are you reading right now? What's inspiring you? That's
Oh
from
my goodness. I'm so embarrassed to admit that I have not had a lot of time to read, given all the things that have been happening in my life. But I have a whole stack of books that I've pre-ordered that have come. There's one that I'm like, there are a couple that I'm particularly excited about. One is continuing this thread on abolition, is called Becoming Abolitionist by Derica Purnell. I don't know if that's the correct pronunciation of her last name, but it's about abolition. And I also have Crying in H Marked. That's been bookmarked that I haven't gotten to, but I know it's incredible. I've heard so many good things about it, and I'm really excited to read. But I don't know if I'm ready to just I don't know, cry and be deep in my feelings just yet, because I feel like I just came out of that period of being in my feels. But I know that that's something that I really want to do when I have time.
Definitely. Well, thank you everyone who was out there virtually hanging out with us tonight. Like I said, my name is Adam. I'm from Tattered Cover. I put together all these events, so I'm grateful that people show up. I'm grateful for people like Michelle and Renee who will talk and still virtually after all these months. You can find us at tattercover.com. Michelle, where can we find you? Where should we follow you?
I'm on all the social media platforms. I'm on Instagram, that's at Michelle Kim, or Twitter, MJ Michelle Kim, and LinkedIn, and also my website, michellemijungkim.com. So I'd love to stay in touch with everyone. And Adam, thank you so much for creating space for this conversation, and Renee for being in conversation with me as always.
Thank you so much.
Thanks to both of you.
And then you could buy Michelle's book at tattercover.com. I put the link in the chat. Thank you, everyone, and have a safe and fun Tuesday night in October. I can't believe it's October.
Yes.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.
Okay, so we are no longer live.